He walked into a hallway and vanished without a trace. Cameras captured his entrance, but no exit. For 18 years, his family searched in agony. Police hit dead ends, and a city whispered about the impossible. Now, a buried nightmare crawls back to the surface. Subscribe now, unlock the shattering truth in the final chapter. You won't see the end coming. The rain wasn't just falling on Columbus that night. It was insisting. A cold, persistent April downpour that slicked the streets around Ohio State University into obsidian mirrors, reflecting the garish neon and the blurred halos of streetlights. It was Friday, April 7th, 2006, pushing 1:45 a.m. Inside the ugly Tuna Saloona on North High Street, the air hung thick with the cloying perfume of spilled beer, cheap cologne, and the frantic energy of students releasing the week's pressure valve. Finals loomed, a dark cloud on the academic horizon, making this celebration feel almost desperate. Brian Alden was at its heart, yet somehow slightly adrift. 27 years old, a third-year med student radiating a potent mix of exhaustion and wired relief. His sandy hair was messy, his usually sharp green eyes softened by several pints, but a grin was plastered across his face as he clapped his friend Mark on the shoulder. They just finished a brutal round of exams. Pathophysiology conquered, at least temporarily. Brian's future felt tangible. The white coat, the stethoscope, the chance to mend broken things. His parents, Arthur and Maureen, were already picturing the graduation photos. His younger brother, Alex, saw him as invincible. One more, Mark shouted over the din of the killers blasting from the speakers, gesturing towards the bar, a sea of bobbing heads and raised glasses between them. Brian checked his watch, a cheap digital thing he'd owned since undergrad. "Nah, man, gotta tap out," he yelled back, his voice raspy. "Early round tomorrow. Gotta look vaguely professional." He flashed a tired but genuine smile. "Tell Jess I said bye. Think I saw her near the bathrooms." Mark nodded, already turning towards the bar. "Drive safe, Alden. Don't let the cadaver juice get you." Brian weaved through the throng, a familiar dance of apologies and nudges. He passed the raised DJ booth, the bass vibrating in his chest. He passed the dimly lit alcoves where couples murmured, oblivious. He passed the main entrance, briefly catching a glimpse of the wet, shimmering chaos of High Street beyond the bouncer's bulk. His target was the less conspicuous interior exit, a heavy fire door leading to a short hallway, stairs, and ultimately the parking garage. It was the quickest way out, avoiding the rain-swept sidewalk. He didn't look out of place, didn't look distressed, didn't look like a man about to step off the face of the earth. He was just Brian Alden, tired med student, heading home. He pushed through the heavy fire door, the cacophony of the bar instantly muffled. The hallway was utilitarian. Concrete floor, cinder block walls painted industrial beige, harsh fluorescent lighting. Security cameras, small domes like unblinking mechanical eyes, watched from the ceiling corners. To his immediate left was the stairwell door leading down. Straight ahead, the hallway turned sharply left towards the service elevators and another exit. The air was cooler here, smelling faintly of damp concrete and stale grease. And then nothing. Brian Alden walked through that fire door at approximately 1:55 a.m., captured clearly on camera 3, the one mounted high in the corner, covering the entrance from the bar and the length of the hallway towards the turn. He was alone. He paused for a fraction of a second, perhaps orienting himself in the sudden quiet, perhaps just shifting his weight. He didn't reach for the stairwell door. He didn't proceed straight toward the service elevators. He simply vanished from the camera's frame as he moved out of its immediate sight line near the turn. The timestamp blinked, 1 hour, 55 minutes, and 17 seconds. The next camera, camera 4, mounted further down the hall around the bend, covering the service elevators and the secondary exit door, never saw him. Not a shadow, not a blur, not a flicker of movement. The feed remained stubbornly, chillingly empty. Brian Alden entered the hallway. He did not exit via the stairs. He did not exit via the service elevators or the secondary door. He did not return to the bar. He ceased to exist within the concrete confines of that fluorescent-lit passageway. The phone shattered the Alden family's silent pre-dawn. Arthur, Brian's father, fumbled for the receiver on the nightstand, his heart already doing a clumsy jig against his ribs. Calls at 3:30 a.m. never brought good news. Maureen stirred beside him, a low murmur of concern escaping her lips before she was fully awake. Arthur Alden? The voice on the other end was young, male, trying for official, but fraying at the edges. Campus police. Yes? Who is this? Arthur's voice was gravelly with sleep and dread. It's Officer Davies, OSUPD. We're trying to locate your son, Brian. Is he home? Arthur sat bolt upright, the sheet pooling around his waist. Brian? No, he's out with friends. Studying? What's wrong? Maureen was fully awake now. Sitting up, her hand gripping Arthur's forearm, her eyes wide and searching his face in the gloom. Sir, his friends reported him missing from the Ugly Tuna Saloon earlier tonight. They say he left around 2 a.m., but he hasn't returned home, isn't answering his phone. They're concerned. Missing. The word felt alien, impossible. Brian wasn't a child. He was responsible, driven. He probably crashed at a friend's place. Overslept. Arthur was trying to convince himself as much as the officer. That's what we're hoping, Mr. Alden. But his friends are adamant. He told them he was heading home. His car is still in the Ugly Tuna garage. We'd like you to come down, help us piece together his movements. Just as a precaution, the drive to the campus police station was a blur of rain-slicked streets and gnawing terror. Maureen sat rigid in the passenger seat, her knuckles white on her purse strap, staring straight ahead, whispering prayers under her breath. Arthur gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing through scenarios. Brian hurt, Brian arrested, for what? Brian lost. The word missing echoed, hollow and terrifying. The station was a fluorescent-lit purgatory. Mark and Jess, Brian's friends, looked like ghosts themselves, pale, red-eyed, vibrating with shock and guilt. They recounted the evening, the drinks, the laughter, Brian saying goodbye, heading for the interior exit. He was fine, Mr. Alden. Jess choked out, tears spilling over. A little drunk, maybe, but fine. Happy even. He just walked toward the back hall. And then nothing. The initial police report felt clinical, inadequate. Asterisk Brian Alden, 27, male, white, 6 feet 1 inch, 180 pounds, sandy brown hair, green eyes. Last seen wearing dark jeans, a gray Ohio State hoodie, white sneakers. Disappeared from the Ugly Tuna Saloon between 1:45 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. on April 8, 2006. Vehicle located on premises. Asterisk the officer taking the report offered platitudes. Young men his age sometimes need space. He'll probably turn up. But he didn't turn up. Not that day. Not the next. Panic, cold and absolute, began to solidify in the Alden household. Maureen moved through the rooms like a sleepwalker, touching Brian's textbooks, his stethoscope box, a gift she'd given him when he got into med school, the jacket he'd left draped over a chair. She'd break down suddenly, sobs racking her thin frame, collapsing into Arthur's arms. Arthur, a quiet, methodical engineer, fought the rising tide of dread with action. He became a relentless force. He mapped Brian's route home. Every alley, every side street, every potential shortcut a student might take, even though Brian hadn't left the garage. He plastered missing person flyers, Brian's smiling, hopeful face under the stark, accusatory word missing, on every telephone pole, in every shop window within a 5-mile radius. He badgered the police daily, sitting for hours in the precinct, his voice tight with controlled desperation, demanding updates that never came. Alex, Brian's 22-year-old brother, still in college himself, channeled his shock and fear into frantic, almost manic energy. He organized search parties. Friends, classmates, neighbors, strangers touched by the story, fanned out across the campus area, combing through rain-sodden parks, peering into dumpsters, shouting Brian's name until their voices were hoarse. They checked hospitals, morgues, shelters, anywhere a hurt or confused person might end up. Every call to the tip line, Every reported sighting, a tall guy in a gray hoodie near the library, someone matching his description sleeping under a bridge miles away, sent Alex sprinting to the location, hope flaring bright and desperate, only to gutter out into crushing disappointment. He became gaunt, shadows like bruises under his eyes, his usual easygoing nature replaced by a brittle intensity. The media picked up the story. Vanishing med student, mystery on High Street. Brian's face smiled out from TV screens and newspaper front pages. The narrative was irresistible. The promising future doctor vanished without a trace after a night out. The police held a press conference. They revealed the chilling, inexplicable detail that would become the grim bedrock of the case: the security footage. Brian Alden walked into the hallway. He never walked out. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of him returning to the bar. He was there, captured in grainy black and white, a living, breathing man. And then, within the confines of a monitored hallway, he simply ceased to be. Detective Vargas say, weary man with eyes that had seen too much, laid out the facts for the Aldens in a small, airless interview room. He pointed at freeze frames on a monitor. This is Brian entering the hall at 1 hour, 55 minutes, and 17 seconds. Camera 3. He moves out of frame here, near the bend towards camera 4's coverage. Camera 4. Vargas clicked the mouse. The timestamp advanced. Empty hallway. Never sees him. We've watched it frame by frame. For hours. Days. He doesn't appear. The stairwell door was alarmed. It wasn't triggered. The service elevator logs show no activity during that window. The secondary exit door was locked from the outside. It would have triggered an alarm if opened. We've searched that hallway, the stairs, the elevator shaft, the garage levels accessible from there. Nothing. It's like he walked through a wall. Maureen made a small, wounded sound. Arthur stared at the screen, at the ghostly image of his son paused mid-stride. That's impossible. He whispered, the words scraping his throat raw. People don't just disappear. Vargas sighed, the sound heavy with shared frustration and the weight of the inexplicable. We know, Mr. Alden. We know. We're exploring every angle. Construction was happening adjacent to that part of the building then. We're checking if there was any temporary access, any gaps, but preliminary checks show nothing obvious. We're interviewing everyone who was in the bar, staff, patrons. We're tracking his phone, credit cards, nothing. It's active, pinging off towers, but we can't locate it. It just stopped moving near the bar. The revelation about the cameras didn't bring answers. It deepened the abyss. It wasn't just that Brian was missing. It was that his disappearance defied the fundamental logic of space and time captured on tape. The hallway became a cursed place in their minds. Maureen couldn't bear to look at photos of the bar. Arthur found himself obsessively sketching the layout from Vargas's descriptions, trying to find the impossible gap, the hidden door, the flaw in the surveillance. Alex stopped organizing searches. The energy drained out of him, replaced by a hollow-eyed confusion that mirrored the maddening footage. Where did you go, Brian? How? Weeks bled into months. The frantic energy of the first days bled away, leaving behind a thick residue of exhaustion and despair. The media moved on to fresher tragedies. The police investigation, while technically open, grew colder, relegated to a back burner as new, solvable crimes demanded attention. Vargas called less frequently, his updates filled with diminishing returns. No new leads, Mr. Alden. We're still monitoring the tip line. We've re-interviewed staff, nothing substantial. The Alden family home became a museum of absence. Brian's room remained untouched, a shrine gathering dust. Textbooks lay open on his desk, frozen in time. Maureen stopped cooking Brian's favorite meals. Arthur stopped fixing things around the house. What was the point? The silence between them grew heavier, punctuated only by Maureen's stifled sobs or Arthur's frustrated sighs. They orbited each other, bound by shared grief, but isolated by the terrifying, unanswerable question. Alex drifted further away, moving into an apartment near campus, but rarely attending classes. He spent nights scouring obscure online forums about disappearances, alien abductions, government conspiracies, anything that offered an explanation, however outlandish, for the impossible void where his brother had stood. He grew bitter, snapping at his parents, accusing the police of incompetence or worse. Hope, that fragile, tenacious thing, didn't die all at once. It faded, like a photograph left in the sun. Each birthday Brian wasn't there to celebrate. Each Christmas with his empty chair. Each anniversary of April 8th, a day marked on their calendars with a black, suffocating weight. 5 years passed, then 10. Maureen's hair turned fully white. Arthur's shoulders slumped permanently. Alex became a ghost of his former self, haunted and closed off. They stopped talking about Brian as much. The pain was too vast, the mystery too corrosive. The case file gathered dust in a cold storage room downtown. Brian Alden became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered by students heading to high street bars. Remember the med student? Vanished right inside the tuna. Never seen leaving. Creepy, huh? 18 years. A lifetime. The world moved on. Smartphones replaced flip phones. The ugly tuna changed ownership, underwent renovations. Ohio State University buildings rose and fell. The Aldens learned to breathe around the jagged hole in their lives, a constant, aching presence they no longer dared to probe. The impossible hallway footage was relegated to the darkest corner of their minds, a locked box containing pure, unspeakable dread. They had accepted, in the quiet, shattered places within them, that they would never know, that Brian was gone, swallowed by an enigma that defied reason, leaving behind only the grainy, haunting image of his final, ordinary step into the unknown. The mystery was a tombstone, until the day the earth shifted beneath it. 18 years is an ocean of silence. For the Aldens, it had become a landscape they navigated by instinct, avoiding the jagged reefs of memory and the fathomless trenches of the unanswered. Arthur, now pushing 70, moved with the careful deliberation of a man carrying fragile, invisible cargo. Maureen's eyes, once bright with warmth, held a permanent, distant glaze, as if perpetually focused on a horizon just out of reach. Alex, nearing 40, bore the weight of unresolved grief in the sharp lines of his face and the guarded stillness of his presence. They gathered for Sunday dinners, a ritual maintained with grim determination, conversations skirting carefully around the vast, unspoken void at the table's head. Brian's name was rarely uttered. His room remained sealed, a dusty time capsule preserving the scent of ambition and vanished youth. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October 2024. A plain, slightly battered cardboard box, postmarked from Columbus, but bearing no return address. Arthur found on the porch amidst the mundane clutter of flyers and grocery coupons. The sight of it triggered no immediate alarm, just a flicker of weary curiosity. Bills, probably, or another misguided charity appeal addressed to the parents of the vanished med student. He carried it inside, the weight unremarkable, and set it on the cluttered kitchen table where Maureen was methodically wiping crumbs that weren't there. "Something for us," he said, his voice raspy with disuse. Maureen glanced at the box, her expression unchanging. Arthur retrieved a utility knife from a drawer. The blade sliced through the packing tape with a dry rasp. Inside, nestled amidst crumpled, yellowed newsprint, headlines about Ohio State football victories from 2006, lay an object that froze the blood in Arthur's veins. It was a phone, an old, clamshell Nokia, the kind ubiquitous in the mid-2000s. Its silver casing was scratched and dented, one corner crushed inward. A thick patina of grime and something darker, like dried mud or perhaps corrosion, coated its surface. But clinging stubbornly to the hinge, almost invisible beneath the grime, was a tiny sticker, a faded green medical caduceus. Brian's sticker. He put it on his phone the first week of med school. Arthur's hand trembled violently. The utility knife clattered onto the table. He made a sound, a choked gasp that wasn't quite a word. Maureen turned, her cloth pausing mid-wipe. "Arthur, what is it?" Her gaze followed his, landing on the phone. Her breath hitched, a sharp, painful intake. Her hand flew to her mouth. No, it's... Arthur couldn't finish. He reached out, fingers hovering over the filthy device, as if it were radioactive. Slowly, reverently, he lifted it from the nest of newsprint. It felt unnaturally cold, heavy with the weight of years and unspeakable secrets. The grime was thick under his fingertips. He recognized the model. Brian had been delighted with its durability. Asterisk, indestructible, Dad. Asterisk, he'd laughed. With shaking hands, Arthur found the power button, half expecting nothing, half terrified it might work. He pressed it. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration hummed in the device. Then, impossibly, a weak, jaundiced yellow light glowed from beneath the grime on the tiny external screen. The Nokia logo flickered, faded, then steadied. The phone was powering on. "Dear God," Maureen whispered, collapsing into a chair, her face ashen. The internal screen lit up, dim and pixelated. The battery icon was a sliver of red. The signal bars flickered erratically, searching for a network long since upgraded. But there it was, the background image Brian had set. A slightly blurry photo of their golden retriever, Max, long since passed away, tongue lolling happily on their old living room rug. Arthur's vision blurred. The mundane familiarity of the image, juxtaposed with the filthy, battered reality of the phone, was a physical blow. This wasn't just an object, it was an artifact from a tomb. Brian's tomb. Check the calls. Maureen breathed, her voice thin with terror and a horrifying sliver of hope. Messages. Arthur's thumb, slick with cold sweat, fumbled with the grimy keypad. The navigation felt archaic, clumsy. He accessed the call log. Most entries were faded, corrupted by time, and low battery, unknown number. Mark cell. Jess cell. Mom home. Dad work. The dates. April 7th, 2006. The night. His thumb hovered over the select button on the last received call. Timestamp 2:07 a.m. Unknown number. He pressed it. The phone whirred faintly, processing. Then the screen changed, calling. It lasted only seconds before the weak signal died, and the screen flashed. Call failed. Voicemail. Arthur rasped, navigating with frantic clumsiness. He had voicemail. He found the icon. One new voicemail. Received. April 8th, 2006. 2:08 nachts. The timestamp burned into Arthur's retinas. Minutes after Brian vanished from cameras. The battery icon blinked a desperate, final red warning. Arthur pressed play. He held the phone to his ear. Maureen leaned forward, her knuckles white on the table edge, her breath held. Static. Thick, wet, hissing static, like radio waves filtered through mud. Then a voice. Brian's voice. But distorted, strained, choked with terror and something else, pain? Exhaustion? It was barely audible beneath the cacophony of noise. Dad? Ken? Hear me? Trapped. It's dark, so dark. A cough, ragged and wet. Not the bar, the wrong place. More static, swallowing words. Walls moving, sounds scratching. A gasp, sharp and pained. Don't trust the... The voice cut off abruptly, swallowed by a sudden surge of deafening, digital screech. A sound like metal tearing, electronic screams. It lasted only a second before dissolving back into the muddy static hiss. Then Brian's voice again, weaker, fainter, a desperate whisper scraped raw. Find me, please, under the... Silence. Not the empty silence after a message, but a dead, hollow silence. The voicemail ended. The red battery icon vanished. The phone screen went dark. Utterly, finally dead. No amount of pressing the power button revived it. It was a corpse once more. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, heavier than the 18 years that preceded it. Arthur stared at the dead phone in his hand, its grime now mingling with the cold sweat on his palm. Maureen hadn't moved. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the phone as if it might sprout fangs. The terror in Brian's voice, the sheer, unadulterated panic and confusion, echoed in the sterile air, violating the fragile peace they'd built on resignation. Trapped, Arthur whispered, the word tasting like ash. Dark. Not the bar. His mind reeled. Not the bar, but the cameras, the hallway. He was in the bar complex. They who? Don't trust the trust who? The police? The bar staff? Someone else? Under what? The building? The city? Scratching sounds, walls moving. It was him. Maureen breathed, a tear finally escaping, tracing a path through the fine lines on her cheek. Oh God, Arthur! He was alive. He was calling. The horror of that realization, that their son had been trapped, terrified, possibly injured, alive after vanishing, while they sat helpless miles away, crashed over her. A low moan escaped her lips, building into a wail of pure, agonized despair that shattered the kitchen silence. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking violently. Arthur's own grief was momentarily eclipsed by a surge of white-hot, primal rage and a terrifying, renewed purpose. He carefully, almost ceremoniously, placed the dead phone back into its nest of newsprint. His hands, though still trembling, were steady now with a terrible resolve. He picked up the landline phone, its corded familiarity a stark contrast to the technological relic on the table. He dialed a number he hadn't called in over a decade, a number etched into his memory by years of desperate pleas. Detective Vargas's extension at CPD. Vargas, now Lieutenant Vargas and nearing retirement himself, answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the weary cadence of decades on the job. Vargas. Lieutenant. Arthur's voice was low, rough, vibrating with an intensity that instantly commanded attention. It's Arthur Alden, Brian's father. A beat of surprised silence. Mr. Alden, it's been a long time. Is everything all right? Vargas's tone shifted, alert. The Aldens didn't call for pleasantries. No. Arthur's gaze remained locked on the filthy Nokia. Something arrived. Today. Brian's phone. The one he had that night. Silence. Then Vargas's voice, sharp, professional. His phone? You're certain? His medical sticker. His background photo. It powered on. Briefly. Arthur took a shuddering breath. There was a voicemail. Left at 2:08 a.m. April 8, 2006. Vargas's intake of breath was audible. You listened to it? Yes. Arthur closed his eyes, the distorted terror in his son's voice echoing in his skull. He was trapped. Somewhere dark. He said, not the bar. He said they and don't trust that it cut off. He mentioned sounds scratching, walls moving. He asked for help. He said, under the before it died. Arthur opened his eyes, the rage simmering. He was alive, Vargas. After he vanished from your cameras. He was alive and terrified, and we did nothing. Maureen's sobs were a raw counterpoint in the background. Mr. Alden, Vargas's voice was tight, urgent. Do not touch the phone anymore. Do not try to power it on again. Put it back in a box, exactly as you found it. Don't touch the packaging. I'm sending a forensic team and a patrol car right now. Do you understand? Right now. We understand, Arthur said, his voice flat, cold. The shock was hardening into something else. A furious, icy determination. 18 years of passive agony were over. The ghost had reached out from the machine. The impossible hallway had just become a crime scene again. And Arthur Alden would tear apart the world to find where his son had truly been trapped in the dark, and who, or what, he couldn't trust. The mystery wasn't solved. It had just cracked open, revealing depths far more horrifying than mere disappearance. The silence of 18 years had been broken by a voice from the grave, whispering of moving walls and hidden enemies, and it demanded answers written in blood and concrete. The Alden kitchen, once a place of quiet, resigned grief, became a sterile, buzzing crime scene within the hour. Lieutenant Vargas arrived first, his face a mask of professional calm that couldn't quite hide the shock in his eyes as he carefully lifted the Nokia from the newsprint, encasing it immediately in a clear evidence bag. His hands, Arthur noted with a detached fury, were steady. Unlike his own had been, forensic technicians followed, moving with quiet efficiency that felt obscenely loud in the strained silence. They photographed the box, the newsprint, the table surface. They dusted for prints Arthur knew wouldn't be there. The sender was too careful. A tech in blue gloves meticulously collected the crumpled 2006 sports pages, sealing them separately. Another scanned the exterior of the box with a handheld device, searching for trace evidence invisible to the naked eye. The air filled with the sharp tang of chemical sprays and the low hum of equipment. Maureen sat rigidly at the far end of the table, a blanket Vargas had thoughtfully provided draped over her shoulders. She stared blankly at the wall, flinching slightly with every click of a camera shutter, every rustle of an evidence bag. Hearing Brian's voice had ripped open a wound 18 years in the healing. The raw terror in his distorted whisper played on a loop in her mind, drowning out the present. Asterisk trapped. Dark. Not the bar. Don't trust the asterisk who? Who couldn't they trust? The police who had failed? The bar owners? The friends who last saw him? The world itself? Arthur stood near the doorway, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He watched Vargas, not the technicians. He tracked the detective's every micro-expression, the slight tightening of his jaw when he bagged the phone, the way his eyes lingered on the faded caduceus sticker, the thoughtful furrow in his brow as he listened to Arthur recount the voicemail message again, verbatim, his voice devoid of inflection. He said under the, Arthur repeated, his gaze locked onto Vargas. Under the what, Lieutenant? The building? The city? What was he trying to say? Vargas sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped gray hair. We don't know yet, Mr. Alden, but we will find out. This changes everything. He gestured towards the bag phone, now being carefully placed into a hardened case. This phone is evidence. Hard evidence we never had. The voicemail. It confirms he was alive and in distress shortly after he disappeared from the hallway. It confirms he wasn't where we thought he was. It confirms you were wrong, Arthur stated flatly. For 18 years. Wrong about the hallway being the last point. Wrong about him potentially walking away. Wrong about everything. The accusation hung heavy in the chemically scented air. Vargas didn't flinch, but his eyes held a weary acknowledgement. Yes, the physical evidence we had, the camera footage, pointed definitively to that hallway. This voicemail suggests displacement, that he was taken or somehow transported from that location very quickly. And the references, they don't trust the walls moving. He shook his head, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through his professional veneer. It implies organization, planning, something far beyond a random act. A technician approached Vargas, holding a tablet. Lieutenant, preliminary on the box and packing material. Newsprint is consistent with local Columbus papers from late September/early October 2006. Generic, untraceable. Box is common moving box, sold nationwide. Postmark is Columbus, processed downtown yesterday. No useful prints on exterior surfaces so far. Significant trace inside, dust particulates. Heavy concentration of gypsum dust, mineral deposits consistent with concrete degradation, and elevated moisture indicators. Like it was stored somewhere very damp and cold for a long time. Basement. Underground space. Underground. Asterisk Arthur's mind snagged on the word. Under the Brian's desperate whisper echoed. Under the damp cold trace on the phone box, the damp concrete smell in the hallway Vargas described years ago. Vargas's eyes met Arthur's, a silent understanding passing between them. The sterile kitchen felt suddenly claustrophobic, the air thick with the weight of 18 years of dust and lies. The impossible hallway was just the beginning. The real prison, the dark place where Brian had been trapped, calling out in terror while the world moved on above him, lay somewhere beneath. And the people who put him there, they were still out there. The hunt, cold for so long, was now a race against time buried deep in the earth. The past wasn't just reaching out, it was clawing its way up from below. The sterile chill of the forensics lab clung to Lieutenant Vargas as he pushed open the door to the cramped observation room. Inside, Arthur Alden sat rigidly, staring through the one-way glass. Below, bathed in harsh examination lights, sat Brian's Nokia, dissected like an archaeological artifact. Maureen was home, sedated, under Alex's watchful, haunted gaze. Arthur had insisted on being here. He needed to see the bones of the mystery laid bare. Trace is definitive, Vargas stated, his voice low, joining Arthur. He pointed toward the monitor displaying magnified images, gritty particles clinging to the phone's crevices. Gypsum dust, degraded concrete particulates, mineral salts associated with prolonged groundwater exposure. And this, he tapped another screen showing spectral analysis. Elevated levels of specific anaerobic bacteria, the kind that thrives in sealed, flooded environments. Old foundations, forgotten basements, tunnels, under. Asterisk Brian's whisper scraped Arthur's nerves. Under the voicemail audio, Vargas continued, pulling up a waveform on a separate monitor. The terrifying screech dominated the display. Forensic audio cleaned it up as much as possible. Beneath the distortion, listen. He played a filtered segment. The metal-on-metal tearing screech was still present, chilling. But layered underneath, faint yet distinct, was another sound. A deep, resonant groan, like massive stone shifting under immense pressure. Then a rhythmic metallic clang, 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 echoing as if down a long, hollow pipe. Sounds of industry. Or excavation. Construction. Arthur breathed, the pieces crashing together. The ugly tuna renovations in '06. The site next door. Vargas nodded grimly. Simmons Tower. Massive project. Deep foundations started that spring. Their site abutted the ugly tuna's service corridor. He pulled up an old architectural schematic on a tablet. The tuna's hallway, the turn, the service elevator shaft, and right beside it, separated by what should have been a thick concrete firewall, the gaping excavation pit for Simmons Tower subterranean levels. We assumed it was sealed off. Properly. You assumed wrong, Arthur stated, his voice cold steel. He fell, or was pushed into that pit, into their construction site. While you were staring at empty cameras, my son was buried alive next door. The image, Brian, injured, disoriented, plunging into wet, rebar-studded darkness, was a physical agony. Possibly, Vargas conceded, the weight of the oversight crushing. Or access somehow. We never physically checked the adjoining wall on the tuna side. No reason to. The cameras showed no breach. The alarms didn't trigger. But if there was a temporary access point, a weak spot covered over during work hours forgotten, he ran a hand over his face. Simmons Construction. We interviewed foreman back then. Standard procedure. Nothing flagged. A sharp knock interrupted them. A young tech entered, holding a clear evidence bag. Inside was the crumpled sports page from the phone box. Lieutenant, you need to see this. Vargas took the bag, held it to the light. Nestled within the creases of a faded article about the Buckeyes' offensive line, written in faint, smudged pencil, were two words. Ask Henderson, asterisk. Henderson. Vargas frowned. Bill Henderson? He was the night foreman for Simmons Construction on that site. Retired years ago. Moved to Florida. Arthur was on his feet. Where? The Florida sun beat down with oppressive cheerfulness on the manicured lawn of the retirement bungalow. Bill Henderson looked shrunken inside his loose polo shirt, his skin papery, eyes clouded by cataracts, and something deeper, a pervasive weariness. Cancer, Vargas had learned en route, was finishing what time had started. Henderson didn't seem surprised to see them. He ushered them into a dim living room smelling of antiseptic and dust. He sank into an armchair, oxygen hissing softly from a nearby tank. Knew someone would come eventually, he rasped, his voice a dry leaf scraping stone. He looked directly at Arthur. You're his dad. Got his eyes. The observation held no warmth, only resignation. What happened to my son, Mr. Henderson? Arthur's voice was low, dangerous. Henderson sighed, a long, rattling sound. April '06. Simmons Tower site. We were pouring the final sublevel slab. Deep, dark as hell down there. Night shift was small. Me, 2 laborers. He coughed, wincing. Heard a commotion around 2 a.m. From the ugly tuna side. Scraping. Then a crash. Sounded like rubble falling. We went to look. Thought maybe a rat knocked something over near the shared firewall. He paused, closing his eyes. Found him. In the pit. Your boy. half buried in loose fill and broken concrete near the base of the wall. Looked like he'd fallen through a gap. A section of the old tuna foundation weed underpinned. Must have been unstable. Covered during the day, I guess. He was conscious, badly hurt, leg twisted wrong, bleeding from the head. Terrified, Arthur's fists clenched, nails digging into his palms. Asterisk alive. Right there, asterisk. We called the site supervisor. Radovich. Henderson spat the name. He came down, took one look, panicked. Said a death on site, especially involving the bar next door. Lawsuits. Project delays. Million. Henderson looked away, shame twisting his features. He said we never saw him. Said it was an accident waiting to happen on their property. Ordered us to cover him up. Pour the slab over him. The room tilted. Arthur heard Vargas's sharp intake of breath. Asterisk cover him up. Pour the slab. Over him. Asterisk the words echoed. Monstrous, final. Brian hadn't vanished. He'd been entombed. We argued, Henderson whispered. God help us, we argued. But Radovich, he had power. Threatened our jobs. Worse. Said he'd make sure we took the fall. Tears welled in the old man's milky eyes. He was still alive, Mr. Alden, when we started covering him. He was crying, calling out for his dad. Henderson met Arthur's devastated gaze. I couldn't do it. Not completely. When Radovich wasn't looking, I shoved his phone, his backpack, into the fill near him. Before the concrete came. So maybe someone would find him. Someday. Arthur couldn't breathe. The image was unbearable. Brian, broken, terrified, watching as men shoveled dirt and rubble over him, sealing him into a cold, concrete grave. His son's final moments were a waking hell of betrayal and suffocating darkness. Radovich paid us off, Henderson choked out. Hush money. Transfer me out. Made us sign NDAs. Threatened our families. We kept quiet. For 18 years. He looked at the oxygen tank, a grim finality in his eyes. Got the diagnosis, knew I had to send something back. Found his phone, where I'd hidden it before they demolished the old Simmons offices years later. Kept it, like a curse. He gestured weakly. Sent it. Knew it would lead you here. Radovich. Vargas growled, already pulling out his own phone. Henderson shook his head, a faint, terrible smile touching his lips. Won't matter. Drove his Porsche off a bridge 5 years ago. Drunk. He coughed again violently. But the sight, the slab, his breath hitched. He said, before the concrete. He kept saying, asterisk the walls. They're moving. Asterisk like he saw something down there in the dark. Henderson's eyes lost focus, staring past them at some unseen horror in the sterile Florida room. Maybe we didn't just bury him. His sentence trailed off into the hiss of oxygen. The confession was complete. The sender was a dying man seeking absolution. The how was an unspeakable act of corporate cowardice and murderous neglect. But the echo of Brian's final, delusional words, the walls, they're moving, hung in the air, a chilling afterthought that promised the darkness under Columbus held more than just bones. The tomb had a secret, and Arthur would tear the city apart to reach it. The Florida sun felt like a cruel joke. Arthur Alden stood on the cracked pavement outside Bill Henderson's bungalow, the humid air thick as wet cement in his lungs. Vargas was barking orders into his phone, coordinating with Columbus PD, demanding immediate warrants, excavation teams, forensic anthropologists. The words probable burial site, Simmons Tower sublevel slab, victim potentially interred alive, were clinical, sterile, utterly inadequate to contain the volcanic rage and soul-crushing horror erupting within Arthur. Brian hadn't vanished. He'd been poured over, sealed into a tomb of greed and cowardice while crying for his father. The image, Brian's terrified face glimpsed in the beam of a work light, shovelfuls of dirt and rubble raining down, the suffocating roar of wet concrete, played behind Arthur's eyes on a nightmarish loop. He was alive. Henderson's shame-filled confession echoed. Asterisk he was crying, calling out for his dad. Asterisk. The flight back to Columbus was a blur of white noise and crushing pressure. Maureen, sedated into a numb haze, leaned against the window, her eyes vacant. Alex, vibrating with a toxic mix of fury and stunned disbelief, scoured the internet for details on Radovich's death, Simmons Tower, anything. Arthur stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the armrests. The quiet engineer was gone. In his place sat a man sculpted from pure, cold vengeance. He would see the concrete broken. He would hold what remained of his son. He would know. Demolishing a section of a skyscraper's foundation slab, even with probable cause, wasn't simple. Legal hurdles, structural engineers, the sheer logistical nightmare. It took agonizing days. Days Arthur spent pacing the sterile confines of a CPD conference room, watching satellite images of the Simmons Tower loading dock on a monitor, the designated access point. He saw the heavy equipment arrive. The diamond-tipped concrete saws, the powerful jackhammers on articulated arms, the industrial vacuum trucks to contain the dust. Each piece was a promise and a torment. Finally, the morning arrived. Gray, drizzling, mirroring the grim task. Arthur, Maureen supported by Alex and a victim's advocate, and Vargas stood behind a cordon of police tape on the loading dock. The air vibrated with the high-pitched scream of the concrete saw biting into decades-old reinforced concrete. Dust, thick and gray as ash, billowed from the access shaft they'd cut through the upper levels, sucked away by roaring hoses but still permeating everything. The air, their clothes, Arthur's very soul. Hours crawled by. The saws gave way to jackhammers, their brutal, rhythmic thud-thud-thud shaking the ground beneath their feet. Each impact felt like a blow to Arthur's chest. He imagined the concrete fracturing, layer by layer, inch by inch, getting closer to the horror sealed below in 2006. Maureen flinched with every strike, her eyes wide and unseeing. Alex's jaw was clenched, so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. Then the jackhammer stopped. An eerie silence fell, broken only by the whine of the vacuum trucks and the nervous murmur of the forensic team descending into the shaft. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. Vargas moved closer to the edge, peering down, a radio crackling in his hand. Minutes stretched into an unbearable eternity. The radio finally spat static, then a voice, strained, professional but shaken. Asterisk, Lieutenant, we have confirmation. Human remains. Partial skeletonization, consistent with long-term interment. Associated personal effects, backpack fragments, and this. Asterisk, a forensic tech emerged from the dust cloud, rising from the shaft. He carried a clear evidence bag. Inside, caked in concrete residue and dark earth, was a small, rectangular object. A battered plastic case. Brian's medical student ID. Arthur could still see the ghost of his son's hopeful, determined smile beneath the grime. Maureen let out a low, guttural moan, her legs buckling. Alex caught her, his own face collapsing as he stared at the plastic rectangle. The final, brutal confirmation. The advocate helped lower Maureen into a waiting chair, her body racked with silent sobs. Arthur didn't move. He stared at the ID, then down into the dark maw of the shaft. They'd found him. After 18 years, they'd found the prison. But Brian's terrified words on the voicemail, echoed by Henderson's dying recollection, slithered through the crushing grief. The walls, they're moving. Was it just the delirium of a dying brain? Or had his son seen something in that final, suffocating darkness, something beyond concrete and rebar, something that made even entombment seem like a secondary horror? The slab was broken, but the deepest darkness remained. Arthur would walk into that pit himself. He needed to see the walls. The descent into the pit was a journey into the underworld. Arthur ignored Vargas's protests, shrugging off the offered hard hat and harness with a curt shake of his head. He needed to feel the weight of the place, the air his son had choked on. The metal ladder rungs were cold, gritty with concrete dust, vibrating faintly with the hum of generators above. Each step down tightened the vise around his chest. The air grew thick, damp, and heavy with the acrid tang of pulverized rock and something older, subtler. The faint, sickly sweet odor of decay finally liberated after 18 years. He dropped the last few feet onto the uneven floor of the excavation. Powerful work lights cast stark, overlapping pools of brilliance, turning the jagged edges of the broken slab above into a fractured ceiling. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the beams. The space was cramped, tomb-like, dominated by the raw, gaping wound in the foundation where the jackhammers had breached the burial layer. Forensic techs, masked and goggled, moved with hushed reverence, their movements casting long, distorted shadows on the rough concrete walls. Arthur's gaze was drawn immediately to the center of their activity. A shallow trench had been carefully cleared within the broken concrete fill. Nestled within it, partially exposed, were bones. Not a complete skeleton, but fragments, a section of rib cage, the unmistakable curve of a pelvis, the long bones of a leg still articulated, twisted at an unnatural angle. Brian's leg, the leg Henderson described. They gleamed a stark, dirty white against the dark earth and gray concrete aggregate. Nearby, partially crushed but recognizable, lay the skeletal remains of a hand. A visceral wave of nausea and grief threatened to buckle Arthur's knees. This wasn't just evidence. This was his son, reduced to calcium and trauma, laid bare in this horrific pit. He forced himself to look, to absorb the brutal reality Henderson's words had only hinted at. The sheer smallness of the space where Brian had been buried alive was suffocating. He could almost hear the echoes of the wet concrete pouring, the panicked shouts of the workers drowned out by the roar, Brian's desperate, fading cries. One of the techs carefully lifted a mud-caked object from near the pelvic bones. A fragment of heavy-duty nylon fabric, the color long faded, adorned with a half-melted plastic logo, the brand of backpack Brian carried his medical techs in. Henderson had told the truth about shoving it in. Another tech gently brushed dirt from a smaller object nearby, a single dirt-encrusted white sneaker. Brian's sneaker. Arthur stepped closer, his boots crunching on loose debris. He ignored the warning glance from a forensic anthropologist meticulously documenting the scene. His eyes scanned the rough concrete walls of the pit, the jagged edges where the old, ugly tuna foundation had been breached. Asterisk the walls, they're moving. Asterisk Brian's terrified whisper, distorted on the voicemail, echoed in the confined space. Was it the delirium of shock, blood loss, suffocation? Or had he seen something in the flickering, dying light of the work lamps? Cracks spiderwebbed through the concrete, dark and ancient-looking. Mineral deposits formed strange, Rorschach-like patterns. In the stark, shifting light, the shadows between the rough, aggregate stones seemed to writhe. Mr. Alden, Vargas's voice came from behind him, tight with concern. He'd follow down. You shouldn't be here. This is where my son died. Arthur interrupted, his voice a raw scrape. He pointed a trembling finger at the exposed bones, the pitiful sneaker. This is the dark place. This is where he called me. He turned, his eyes blazing with a grief so profound it bordered on madness. He said the walls were moving, Vargas. Was he mad? Or did he see something they did? Something Radovich's crew missed in their rush to bury their mistake? He stalked towards the wall nearest the breach, the one adjoining the old, ugly tuna foundation. He ran his hand roughly over the cold, damp concrete, feeling the deep fissures, the crumbling patches. His fingers snagged on a loose piece of aggregate. He pulled. A small chunk, no bigger than his fist, came away in his hand, revealing a patch of darker, almost black material beneath. Older brick, perhaps, or compacted fill. Arthur, please, Vargas urged, stepping forward. The structural engineers are coming down. This whole area is unstable. We need to recover Brian respectfully, then secure the site. Arthur ignored him. He stared at the exposed patch of darkness in the wall, then down. At the bones of his son's hand nearby, fingers curled as if still trying to claw free. The pieces didn't just fit, they screamed. Brian hadn't just been buried, he'd been walled in. And in his final, terrified moments, trapped in crushing darkness, maybe those walls had felt alive, shifting, pressing, sealing his fate. But the patch of darkness under the loose concrete, was it just older brick? Or was it something else? A void? A passage? The source of the scratching sounds he'd heard? The cold dampness seemed to seep from the wall into Arthur's bones, carrying with it a whisper of the unthinkable, that the tomb Radovich created might have been built atop something older and far more hungry. The darkness under Columbus had given up Brian's bones, but it clung fiercely to its final secret. Arthur dropped the concrete chunk. It landed with a dull thud near his son's remains. The sound echoed in the pit, a grim counterpoint to the whine of the vacuum hoses sucking away the dust of 18 years. The excavation was far from over. The chunk of concrete lay at Arthur's feet, a dull, gray accusation. The patch it had revealed in the pit wall wasn't just darkness. It was a void. A ragged fissure, wider than his hand, exhaling a breath of air so cold and stale it made his teeth ache. It smelled of wet stone, ancient rot, and something metallic, like old blood rusting in the earth. The vacuum hoses above seemed to suck harder, pulling that subterranean breath towards them. Arthur stepped back. Vargas barked, his voice tight with alarm. He moved forward, grabbing Arthur's arm. The engineers said this whole section is compromised. One wrong move. Arthur shrugged him off with surprising strength. He didn't take his eyes off the fissure. The cold air whispered against his face, carrying echoes of Brian's final, distorted words. Asterisk scratching, walls moving. Asterisk, not delirium. Perception. He felt it. Arthur murmured, his voice raw. The air moving. From here. He pointed at the black gash. Before Vargas could react, Arthur snatched a heavy-duty flashlight from a nearby tool cart. Ignoring the shouts of the forensic techs and Vargas's renewed protests, he thrust the beam into the fissure. The light didn't hit solid earth or crumbled brick. It speared into emptiness, illuminating rough-hewn stone walls slick with dark moisture. The beam traveled further than it should, revealing a passageway. Not a natural fissure. Not a forgotten utility tunnel. This was something older. The walls were uneven, carved by hand, not machine. The floor, glimpsed below the jagged edge of broken concrete, sloped downwards into impenetrable shadow. And etched into the damp stone near the opening, barely visible, were crude symbols. Intersecting lines, spirals, shapes that looked disturbingly like grasping hands. Oh my God, one of the techs breathed, lowering his camera. Vargas was beside Arthur now, peering into the void, his professional composure cracking. What is this? Arthur didn't answer. His flashlight beam caught movement on the damp floor just inside the passage. Not an animal. Footprints. Old, partially filled with silt, but unmistakable in the powerful light. Large work boots, the tread pattern blurred but clear, and beside them, smaller prints. Sneaker treads, fresh compared to the boots. Size 11. White sneakers. Brian's sneakers. The one they just found, caked in burial soil, was a left. This print, leading into the darkness, was a right. The implications slammed into Arthur with physical force. Brian hadn't just fallen into the construction pit. He hadn't lain passively waiting to be buried. He'd been conscious. He'd crawled. Injured, terrified, he'd seen this fissure, this impossible escape route in the pit wall, and he'd dragged himself into it. Away from the men and the shovels. Into the dark. Not the bar. Asterisk the voicemail fragment made chilling sense. He hadn't been where anyone expected. He'd found this place. This hollow place under the city. He went in here, Arthur rasped, the flashlight beam trembling as it traced the sneaker print leading away from the light. He crawled in, to hide, to escape them. The image was simultaneously heartbreaking and horrifying. Brian, leg shattered, bleeding, pulling himself into an unknown, ancient darkness, believing it was sanctuary. Vargas was already on his radio, his voice urgent. "Command, this is Vargas in the pit. We have a secondary situation. A previously unknown subterranean passage accessed through the burial site wall. Evidence suggests the victim may have entered prior to interment. Require immediate structural assessment additional lighting, and archaeological consult. Repeat, unknown man-made subsurface structure located. He sounded shaken. This wasn't in any manual. Arthur didn't wait. Driven by a compulsion stronger than fear, stronger than reason, he dropped to his knees beside the fissure. The cold air surged out, smelling of secrets buried deeper than Brian. He shone the light down the sloping passage. The sneaker prints, spaced far apart, spoke of agonizing effort. They disappeared around a bend, maybe 20 feet in. The walls glistened. The crude symbols seemed to watch. Alden no. Vargas lunged, but he was too late. Arthur, fueled by 18 years of torment and the visceral pull of his son's final, desperate path, shoved his shoulders through the ragged opening in the pit wall. Concrete scraped against his jacket. Cold, damp stone pressed in. The void swallowed the beam of his flashlight. Brian. Arthur's shout echoed down the stone corridor, a raw, paternal cry that seemed absurd in the primeval silence. It wasn't a call for an answer he expected. It was a declaration, a marking of territory. He was following his son into the dark. He scrambled forward on hands and knees, the rough stone tearing at his palms. The passage was narrow, barely wider than his shoulders, the ceiling low. The air was thick, pressing in, tasting of minerals and immense age. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the frantic scrape of his movements. He rounded the bend, the light beam jerking wildly. The passage opened slightly. His light caught more symbols carved into the wall, spirals within spirals, jagged lines converging. And there, on the damp floor, just before the passage dipped steeply downwards into utter blackness, lay something that stopped his heart. A small, rectangular piece of white plastic. A medical student ID card. Brian's face, young and hopeful beneath a film of grime, stared sightlessly up from the ancient stone floor. It hadn't been buried with him. He'd carried it in here, dropped it, or torn it free. Arthur snatched it up, the plastic cold in his trembling hand. He shone the light past the ID down the steep slope. The beam penetrated only a few feet before being swallowed by the consuming darkness. The sneaker prints ended here, at the edge of the descent. Had Brian fallen? Slid? Or had he simply been too weak to go further? Arthur lifted the light, sweeping the walls near the precipice. And there, scratched into the soft stone with something sharp, perhaps a piece of rebar, were words. Faint, jagged, carved in frantic haste. They dig asterisk asterisk. Don't trust asterisk asterisk. The walls are asterisk asterisk. The message stopped abruptly, the final word unfinished. Below it, a single deep gouge marred the stone, as if the tool had been ripped from Brian's grasp. Arthur's blood turned to ice. They, not just Radovich's crew, someone else, digging. Here, now, 18 years ago. Don't trust who? The police? The city? The walls are. The sentence hung. Incomplete, more terrifying than any conclusion. Asterisk alive? Moving? Watching? Asterisk. He stared into the abyss below, the beam of his light a fragile candle against an ocean of dark. The cold air rising from it carried a new sound now, buried deep beneath the frantic thudding of his own heart. A faint, rhythmic vibration, like distant machinery. Or something huge, breathing in the deep places under the city. Brian hadn't found sanctuary. He'd found something far older and far more hungry. And Arthur was next in line. The hollow place had only just begun to share its secrets. The scratch marks glared back at Arthur in the failing beam of his flashlight. They dig. Don't trust. The walls are. Asterisk asterisk the gouge beneath the unfinished sentence felt like a wound in the world itself. The rhythmic vibration thrummed through the stone beneath his knees, no longer faint suggestion, but undeniable physical force, resonating in his bones, in his molars. Digging. Arthur. Alden. Vargas's voice, muffled and frantic, echoed down the narrow passage from the pit. Get back here now. The structural scan, it's unstable. Whole damn thing could come down. Arthur ignored him. The fear was a live wire in his chest, but it was drowned out by the roaring need to follow the trail, to see what his son had seen in these final, desperate moments. He shone the light down the steep, smooth-worn slope beyond the carved message. It wasn't natural erosion. It was a chute, carved by water or ooze. Brian's sneaker print was there at the very edge, smeared as if he'd slid or been pulled. The vibration intensified. A deep, resonant asterisk THOM. THOM. THOM asterisk. Accompanied now by a higher-pitched metallic whine. Machinery. Big machinery. Operating deep below Columbus. Gripping Brian's ID card like a talisman, Arthur turned onto his back, bracing his boots against the sides of the chute. He pushed off, sliding down the slick stone into darkness. The flashlight beam jerked wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of close, wet walls rushing past. The air grew colder, thicker, tasting now of ozone and diesel fumes beneath the ancient stone and damp. The descent felt endless, a plunge into the planet's gut. He hit the bottom with a jarring thud that knocked the wind from his lungs and sent a lance of pain through his ribs. He lay gasping, the flashlight beam stabbing uselessly at a low ceiling of rough-hewn rock inches above his face. The noise was overwhelming here, a constant, industrial roar punctuated by the heavy THOM that shook the ground. The air vibrated. He rolled on his side, coughing. The passage here was wider, taller, a rough tunnel, maybe 8 feet high, carved from bedrock. His light swept across the floor, thick dust disturbed by recent passage. Not just Brian's lone, desperate prints anymore. Multiple boot prints, heavy treads, crisscrossing, leading deeper into the roaring darkness. Arthur pushed himself up, leaning against the cold, vibrating wall. He followed the tracks. The tunnel curved, the noise growing deafening. A sickly yellow glow began to seep from around the bend ahead, flickering against the stone. Not his flashlight, artificial light. And with it, the smell of diesel exhaust became overpowering, mixed with hot metal and something else. Acrid, chemical. He rounded the bend and stopped dead. The tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space. It wasn't natural. The scale was staggering. Massive support pillars of raw concrete and steel ribbed the vaulted ceiling, disappearing into gloom high above. The floor was a churned mess of mud, rock debris, and metal grates. And dominating the center of this impossible subterranean cathedral was the source of the noise and light. A colossal tunnel boring machine. Its massive, circular cutting head, easily 30 feet in diameter, was partially buried in the raw rock face at the far end of the cavern. Huge hydraulic rams held it in place. Conveyor belts snaked away from it, carrying mounds of pulverized rock into the shadows. Banks of industrial lights mounted on towering scaffolds bathed the scene in a harsh, sodium yellow glare. The air throbbed with the scream of its engines and the rhythmic THOM of its cutting teeth slamming into the bedrock. It was a behemoth, chewing its way deeper under the city. This was no ancient catacomb. This was an active, massive, clandestine excavation. Arthur's mind reeled. Who? How? Why dig here, so deep, so secretly? The Simmons Tower construction next door? Had it been cover? A way to access this depth without raising questions? Was this what Radovich's crew stumbled upon? Was this the they Brian saw? The they who dug? He scanned the edges of the cavern, staying deep in the tunnel's shadow. Figures moved near the machine, dwarfed by its scale. Workers in heavy, mud-caked coveralls and helmets. No company logos. They moved with purpose, checking gauges, monitoring the conveyor belts. Security? Arthur saw no obvious weapons, but their posture spoke of vigilance. Then his light beam, weak but probing, caught something on the cavern floor, near the base of one of the massive support pillars. Discarded debris, a familiar shape. He squinted. A crushed plastic water bottle. Modern design. Next to it, half buried in mud, lay a fragment of gray fabric. Hoodie fabric. Brian's hoodie. Arthur's breath hitched. He hadn't just crawled down here to die. He'd made it this far, into the belly of this monstrous operation. Had they seen him? A med student, broken and bleeding, stumbling into their secret world? Don't trust. Asterisk Brian's warning screamed in his mind. He looked back at the workers. Were they just laborers? Or something else? Guards for something far more valuable or dangerous than a tunnel. A new sound cut through the industrial roar. A sharp, electronic beep, beep, beep. One of the workers near a control panel looked up, then pointed towards Arthur's tunnel. He'd been spotted. A sensor? Motion-activated light? A powerful spotlight mounted on a scaffold near the TBM's control cabin suddenly snapped on, its blinding white beam lancing through the cavern's murky yellow glow. It swept across the floor, then pinned Arthur like an insect against the tunnel wall. He froze, blinded. Shouts echoed. Distorted by the machinery's din, figures started moving towards him, quickening their pace. Not panicked. Purposeful. Intercept. They dig. Asterisk the carved words burned in his memory. They dug a monstrous machine under the city. They buried his son alive to protect it. And now, they'd found a father who followed. The walls weren't just moving. They were closing in, forged of steel and greed, and a secret buried deeper than any grave. Arthur had found the engine of the nightmare. Now he had to outrun it. He turned, scrambling back up the tunnel towards the crumbling pit, the spotlight burning his shadow onto the ancient stone behind him. The roar of the machine now mingled with the shouts of men determined to keep their secret buried. The darkness ahead was his only escape. Arthur scrambled back up the slick chute, concrete dust choking him, dislodged by the violent tremors shaking the tunnel. The blinding spotlight painted his shadow monstrously on the shuddering walls. Shouts echo below, sharp and guttural over the TBM's roar. Close. Too close. He hauled himself over the lip where Brian had carved his warning. Flashlight beam, dancing wildly. The fissure leading back to the burial pit was only yards away. A sliver of dim work light from the world above. Freedom. But the vibration intensified, a deep groan shaking the ancient stone. A crack splintered across the ceiling above him with a sound like gunfire. Dust and pebbles rained down. They're bringing it down. Asterisk the realization struck like ice. They'd sacrificed this access tunnel to seal him in, to bury the secret again. He lunged for the fissure. A figure appeared in its ragged mouth. Not Vargas, not police. A man in mud-streaked coveralls, face obscured by a respirator, blocking the light. He raised something dark and compact. Not a flashlight. A weapon. Arthur threw himself sideways as a laser sight's red burned onto the wall where his head had been. The sharp crack of a suppressed round echoed in the confined space, deafening. Stone chips stung his face. He hit the ground rolling, his own flashlight skittering away, plunging him into near darkness save for the glow from below and the fissure. He scrambled behind a jagged outcrop near Brian's unfinished message. The walls are. Another round ricocheted off stone near his feet. The armed guard advanced cautiously, methodically, cutting off his escape. Below, the shouts grew louder. More coming. Trapped. Between the gun and the collapsing tunnel. Arthur pressed his back against the cold, vibrating stone. His hand brushed the crude carvings Brian had noticed, the spirals the grasping hands. Desperation sharpened his senses. In the faint, chaotic light, he saw it. The symbols weren't random. They formed a pattern. Concentric spirals radiating outwards from a specific point on the wall near the drop-off into the machine cavern. The vibration reached a crescendo. A massive slab of rock sheared away from the ceiling above the fissure with a thunderous roar, crashing down, sealing the exit in a plume of choking dust. The armed guard vanished, buried or retreated. The light from above was gone. Only the sickly yellow glow from the cavern below and the dying beam of his flashlight, pointing towards the symbols, remained. And in that beam, as dust swirled, Arthur saw it clearly. The point where the spirals converged wasn't just carved. It was a seam, a hairline crack running vertically through the bedrock, almost invisible, forming a rough doorway shape. Around its edges, the stone was smoother, worn, used. Brian hadn't just seen the TBM. He'd seen this. An older way. A hidden path within the hidden path. Don't trust the walls. The obvious walls. Trust the hidden ones. The shouts below were closer now. Boots pounded on stone, ascending the slope towards him. He was out of time. With a final surge of adrenaline fueled by his son's cryptic clue, Arthur slammed his shoulder against the spiral convergence point on the wall. Ancient counterweights groaned. Stone scraped on stone. The vertical seam widened with shocking ease, revealing not solid rock, but impenetrable blackness beyond. A gust of even colder, impossibly ancient air, smelling of deep earth and forgotten time, washed over him. He didn't hesitate. As the first helmeted head crested the slope below, laser sight searching, Arthur Alden threw himself through the spiral doorway into the consuming dark, the stone slab grinding shut behind him with a sound like a tomb ceiling. The shouts, the machinery, the world of men and their monstrous machines vanished. Only the profound silence of the deep earth remained, and the fading echo of his own terrified breath. He had followed Brian's path into the final darkness. Now, he would find where it led. The silence in the spiraled chamber wasn't empty. It was a physical weight, thick and ancient, pressing down on Arthur Alden's soul. His flashlight beam, a feeble intrusion, trembled over his son's impossibly preserved face. Brian looked serene, untouched by 18 years of torment, lying on the plinth like an offering on an altar of forgotten gods. The cold radiating from him seeped into Arthur's bones, colder than the pit, colder than death itself. This wasn't peace, it was stasis, an eternal, frozen moment of loss. His gaze drifted to the object resting on Brian's chest, the gift. The dark, non-reflective spiral not hummed with a low, subsonic thrum Arthur felt in his molars and the marrow of his bones. Power pulsed from it, ancient and alien, promising answers, transcendence, perhaps even reunion beyond the swirling vortex of darkness that dominated the far wall, the gate. Its pulsing maw breathed cold, smelling of interstellar voids and crushing depths. It promised an elsewhere. Take it. Step through. Find him. Asterisk, the seductive whisper wasn't audible. It resonated within the spirals covering the walls, vibrating in the air. The Watchers offer eternity. Arthur's hand hovered over the humming artifact. 18 years of desperate searching, of clawing through grief and impossibility, screamed for resolution. To touch it, to claim its power, to follow Brian into that impossible dark. It was the culmination of his obsession. Then, his gaze locked onto Brian's face again. The perfect stillness, the chilling preservation. It wasn't life. It was captivity. This chamber, this gift, this gate, it wasn't sanctuary. It was another kind of tomb, far more profound and terrifying than the concrete slab. The Watchers hadn't saved Brian. They had harvested him, preserved him like a specimen, a key, or a sacrifice for their unfathomable gate. Brian's desperate, distorted voice on the voicemail echoed, cutting through the seductive hum. Don't trust the... He hadn't finished. Don't trust the walls? They were moving, collapsing. Don't trust the men? They buried him alive. Don't trust the light, the false promise of the gate. Don't trust the gift. The warning wasn't about external threats. It was about the false hope offered by the darkness itself. The gift was a chain. The gate was oblivion disguised as transcendence. Trusting it meant abandoning Brian to this eternal, frozen half-life, bound to the Watcher's cold design. A sob, raw and ragged, tore from Arthur's throat, not of despair, but of devastating clarity. He hadn't found his son to join him in the dark. He had found him to set him free. Love, not obsession, finally ignited in Arthur's heart, a fierce, protective flame against the chilling void. He wouldn't subject Brian to eternity as a Watcher's relic. He wouldn't follow him into the swallowing dark. He would break the cycle. With a cry that shattered the chamber's oppressive silence, a roar of paternal grief and furious resolve, Arthur snatched the humming spiral artifact from Brian's chest. The effect was instantaneous. The subsonic hum became a deafening shriek. The spirals on the walls flared with sickly, ephemeral light. The pulsing gate convulsed, its vortex swirling violently. Ignoring the cacophony, the cold biting deeper, Arthur raised the artifact high. It vibrated violently in his grip, fighting him, humming with desperate power. He saw Brian's face, impossibly, flicker, a micro-expression of terror, trapped and aware within the stasis. No more, Arthur bellowed, the sound swallowed by the chamber's chaos. He brought the artifact down with all his strength onto the unyielding spiral plinth. The impact wasn't loud. It was a crack that resonated on a frequency deeper than sound. A wave of pure force exploded outwards, silent and devastating. The dark spiral not shattered into a million obsidian shards that hung suspended for a heartbeat before dissolving into black smoke. Brian Alden's body didn't decay. It unraveled. Like sand caught in a sudden wind, he dissolved into a cascade of shimmering, silvery dust. The dust swirled for a moment, catching the dying light of Arthur's flashlight, forming the faint, fleeting outline of a young man smiling, truly at peace, before dispersing into the frigid air. Gone. The chamber screamed. The spirals on the walls flared blindingly bright, then fractured, lines of darkness racing through them like cracks in ice. The massive gate imploded with a silent, concussive humph, collapsing into a pinpoint of absolute dark that winked out, leaving only scarred dead rock. The hum died. The light vanished. Arthur's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into utter, suffocating blackness. The only sound was his own ragged, shuddering breaths, echoing in the sudden, profound silence of the deep, deep earth. He was alone. He had shattered the gift. He had destroyed the gate. He had freed his son from the Watcher's cold eternity. He had chosen love over the seductive horror of the unknown. The cost was absolute solitude in the crushing dark, cradling only dust and the devastating, necessary peace of final release. The spirals were silent. The Watchers were gone. Only Arthur remained, whispering his son's name into the void, the weight of 18 years finally, terribly, lifted.